All right, so good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar in the 2023 MSHA webinar series by Conmacio Carey. Today we are deviating from the normal presentation and webinar discussion that we had planned for today, which was coincidentally an MSHA update and Federal Mine Safety and Health Review Commission update for the mid-year. So we're deviating a little bit, but somewhat staying true to that theme as we're talking about a pretty significant update in the mining world, which is MSHA has released a proposed silica rule for the industry. So we'll take a look at that today and go through the different provisions of it. It is a pretty voluminous record right now, as anyone who may have jumped into it has seen. So, throughout this process, we'll be sure to keep you guys updated of any changes or anything that pops up, whether through some subsequent webinars dedicated to this rule or by posts on our MSHA Defense Report blog. My name is Nick Scala. If you've joined us before, welcome back. If you're new to the webinar series, welcome. We're happy to have you here today with us. I am the chair of the National MSHA Practice Group here at Conmacio Carey. We're a team of attorneys that help companies and employers across the country in dealing with the Mine Safety and Health Administration and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. At least that's the part of the practice that I work in. So we represent companies in all aspects of dealing with MSHA, whether you're a contractor or an operator running your own mine. So this is going to be a rule, though, that is going to touch on everybody. It is a pretty big development, a significant departure from where MSHA was at currently and historically on regulation of respirable crystalline silica, or as it's currently regulated, respirable quartz. So we'll take a look here just quickly at where we've been and where we still are, and then at the new provisions of the proposed rule. So first off, we're going to be talking a lot today about threshold limit, permissible exposure levels and action levels, and what is going to be the permissible limit for miners to be exposed to respirable crystalline silica during a shift in the new rule. But when we look back where we're at currently, it gives us some context. So the current regulation or permissible exposure limit, as MSHA now calls it, for respirable crystalline silica in the mining industry is 100 micrograms per meter cubed. And that is incorporated through a document called the Threshold Limit Values for Chemical Substances and Workroom Air, adopted by the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists in 1973. It's a mouthful, but it is what has been incorporated into MSHA regulations since MSHA regulations have existed as we know them today in 30 CFR. So a relatively old level. Now, the different agencies and different governmental bodies have revised what they consider their PEL or for respirable crystalline silica over a number of years. Most notably, back in the last decade, OSHA made a significant update. And when we look at the rule today, we'll notice that some of the methods and the sampling requirements and more specifically the PEL and the action level mirror what we see with OSHA. But that is not always been the case with MSHA, and it's currently not the case. So we have our own standalone. It's 100 micrograms per meter cubed right now. The requirements for conducting testing are pretty bare bones, especially in the metal non-metal industry. And that is really 30 CFR 5657 5002. And it just says dust, gas, mist, and fume surveys shall be conducted as frequently as necessary to determine the adequacy of controls. There is no required time frame for which we need to conduct sampling. The expectation is that we do it so that we know whether or not we have exposure concerns. And what we're going to see in this new rule, though, this new proposed rule, I should be careful to continue saying that throughout the day, is that MSHA has got very prescriptive with their sampling. It is a very sample heavy rule. It is a rule that is going to force, really everyone in the industry to conduct a lot of sampling, whether at the beginning or throughout, because the levels that we're talking about now for our permissible exposure level and our action level, they're quite low compared to where we're at. And it's going to result in a lot of sampling that we're going to have to complete and track if it goes into effect in the form which we see it here today. Another change is, or in the existing standard that we're going to see updated here, is that the respiratory protection program requirements in the existing rules incorporate an old ANSI standard going back to 1969. The proposed rule includes an update to a newer standard from ASTM back from a few years ago in 2019, which will obviously include some new requirements, but some of the basic elements carry over. So as we talk about that, let's focus on what we're really going to look at today, which is MSHA's proposed rule. What this rule is called, and what we're seeing the name come out, is lowering minors' exposures to respirable crystalline silica, or as we're going to mention it today quite a bit and refer to it on the slides, RCS, and improving respiratory protection. So when you get these slides out there, I've included a couple hyperlinks on this first page, which are pertinent. One, it was published on July 13th, so a little less than a week ago. It was published in the Federal Register. That is the official publish date of the rule. So for tracking our deadlines on comments and meetings, it is when it's published. When we get a final rule, it will become final much longer down the line. We're not there yet. But if that goes, it comes again, will be published in the Federal Register, and then we'll get an effective date after that. I know MSHA published a kind of sneak peek, a version on June 30th, and they put that out on their social media and through some of their email broadcasts and on their website. But the official version for this process is going to be the Federal Register version. So just so you know that. Comments, if you want to submit comments, are going to be due within 45 days. So that is August 28th. Now, it is possible that that deadline can move if stakeholders, being, minors, industry companies, industry associations, are, enough of us request an extension. It is possible that that will move, but right now our due date is August 28th, which is going to approach quickly, right? We're only about 5.5 weeks away from that. Additionally, MSHA is going to hold some in-person and virtual meetings on this. Each one of these is going to be virtual and in person, and these are open to the public. So at these meetings, again, industry stakeholders can request the opportunity to read a statement on the record. There'll be a number of persons from MSHA there. There was going to be 2 meetings if you read the proposed rule. MSHA has recently added a 3rd meeting to their website, at least on their notice, talking about the rule right now. So the first meeting is going to be August 3rd. That will be on MSHA's headquarters right outside DC in Arlington, Virginia. The second will be a week later in Beckley, West Virginia, which is very close to where the MSHA Academy is. And then the third will be in the Western US over in Denver, Colorado on August 21st. So again, we're talking about it. The timelines are moving quickly. If you want to submit comment, if you want to be a person who gets to speak at one of these, you need to be moving on that and requesting that spot if you want to speak. And we'll talk a bit more about that towards the end. And then lastly, MSHA's published as part of the proposed rule of preliminary risk analysis, talking about the background and the information that went into their decision making when putting this rule together. So some background information, again, for you to review and kind of look at what is out there. But rulemaking process aside, the real elements that we want to talk about are the proposed rule itself and its content. So again, there's a good bit to get through here, so we're going to move quickly while also still trying to give every bit of it its due. But essentially what we're seeing is MSHA is going to create a new part of 30 CFR, Part 60. And 30 CFR is the Code of Federal Regulations, which applies to the mining industry, or to MSHA in particular, which they can enforce. So Part 60 is going to be new. There is no Part 60 currently. It is going to be under Subpart M, which is Uniform Mine Health Regulations. And that is because this rule is going to apply to both coal and metal non-metal. There are some discrepancies in it and areas of distinction, because coal industry already has some pretty prescriptive sampling requirements and some unique challenges that they've already been dealing with for some time there. And then some specific ones to metal non-metal that because they don't have the same requirements right now as coal may under existing standards. But this rule in its permissible exposure level and its sampling expectations for the most part will align between the two. The different sections are going to be, scope and definitions, the Pell, a discussion of that, then methods of compliance, exposure monitoring, corrective actions, respiratory protection, medical surveillance requirements for metal non-metal, and then record keeping. Those are the substantive elements that we'll be talking about today. It is a rule that is going to create a number of different requirements that we currently don't have, but one of the biggest changes, and obviously one of the biggest changes, is going to be that the permissible exposure level is going to be cut in half, right? What did we talk about at the beginning? The existing Pell for MSHA, or threshold limit value, is 100 micrograms per meter cubed. And that is over a full shift exposure over 8 hours. And based on that calculation and the percentage of quartz, we determine whether or not we're going to be exceeding that level. It's a little bit of the math is a bit confusing on the way that we do it with the existing method. This is going to mirror the method of analysis that we see with OSHA. So we are going to eventually get a result under this standard in this new testing analysis that says, you were exposed to X milligrams per meter cubed over the course of your shift. Now it is an 8-hour time weighted average. So we are going to be sampled over the course of 8 hours. That's what it has to go. It comes back to an 8-hour shift. If we are working for 6 hours, we look at it and can extrapolate the math out to meet that 8 hours. If we're working for 12 hours, we roll that back and our exposure is looked at still if we're working for 8 hours. So it's an interesting calculation that we're going to have to get used to in the mining industry. I mean, it's not going to be too far afield from what we currently see in regulation, but that exposure limit is going to be cut in half. So if you have an operation that you are looking at your samples and you're doing samples already, this is something that you have a challenge with, or you've received sampling from MSHA that indicates that you had overexposures. You need to be thinking, because while this rule isn't effective yet, and it's not going to be effective until we get a final rule, until that final rule goes into effect, the likelihood that this 50 milligrams per meter cube Pell is going to change are very low. This is likely going to be the level. This maps what OSHA put into effect in 2016 when that rule went through, and that rulemaking took some time. But we are likely looking at a much lower Pell, a Pell that is 50% of the current Pell moving forward for the industry. Additionally, and this is included in the action or in the definition section, which is why I have that up there, but MSHA is also going to enact an action level. Now, OSHA does the same thing in their regulation. So if you're familiar with that, this isn't a foreign term, but the action level is, again, 1/2 of the Pell. So if you're, keeping track there, the action level is roughly a quarter of the existing MSHA permissible exposure level. And what the action level does is, if we have miners who samples come back and they're exposed above the action level, but below the Pell, we still have to start taking some action. And in this case, it is primarily pointed at just continuing monitoring. But we can't continue monitoring indefinitely. It's not necessarily reasonable to have monitoring take place at the clip that keeping something above the action level might require long term, and that's the intent, right? This is a rule that is intended, and the design and the hope of it is that it forces the implementation and development of engineering controls to reduce dust in the mining industry. So, that takes us to our last element there, compliance methods, right? We are going to talk about this more on the next slide too, but it says the mine operator shall, right? So shall means you have to, you need to, you must install, use, and maintain feasible engineering controls, supplemented by administrative controls when necessary, to keep the exposure at or below the PEL. An important distinction here is this rule expressly prohibits the rotation of miners in order to keep their exposure below the PEL or below the action level. So what's that mean? If we know we have a dusty area or a dusty job, we cannot cycle one person every hour through that job in order to keep their exposure below the action level or below the PEL. MSHA is not going to accept that. And again, that part of that is they're trying to push forward the install and the development of engineering controls rather than allowing personnel mapping to kind of dictate that. And, one of the reasons they give in the proposed rule is that, they don't want to put even more people through the high exposure areas. So something to keep in mind, because that's going to be an important factor. As always, when we're talking about controls, and engineering controls are going to be prioritized, and they are going to be sought after, and they are going to be pushed much more than the administrative controls, and that includes the use of respiratory protection. MSHA has included examples of what they see as the engineering controls that are going to take place, which includes ventilation systems, dust suppression, enclosed cabs with filtered breathing air, water sprays, etc. And this is consistent with what we have seen the last few years. The last few years, when we have been seeing the MSHA initiative on silica, which really has been out in earnest the last 2 years, at least published on their website, but was a prioritization of engineering controls. And really, what we saw was, in order to terminate citations, MSHA was really pushing companies and operators to implement engineering controls and really requiring them to come back with samples below the PEL, which is typical when you need to abate a condition related to an overexposure. But they were putting action plans in place and requesting operators to put action plans in place that reduced it by the implementation of engineering controls. So this isn't necessarily a surprise to us. It also, though, places burdens on the operators to update equipment or processing to bring it below that PEL and the action level if we want to stop our required periodic monitoring under this new proposal. So, we are going to see, one, a lot of sampling if this rule goes into effect as it is now, and two, probably a significant amount of operations are going to have to really look hard at their existing processing equipment, their existing dust control measures, and begin investing in improvements there in order to maintain compliance. Because, this rule, there's a lot of things about it that are new, that are changes. Some things that are not going to change are the enforcement of it, right? If we have overexposures, and we have a history of overexposures, and we're not getting things below the PEL, there are methods of compliance in here, but they're meant to be temporary as we get them under. If we're not moving quickly enough, MSHA can still come out and try to enforce on failures to abate the condition or failure to implement sufficient corrective actions to get us below the PEL again. So we need to keep that in mind, that it's not just the sampling, it's not just the elements that we are going to be having to deal with kind of from our own internal policies, but MSHA is still going to be coming out and enforcing this and looking at this. And if you're an operation that is already getting focused by MSHA for exposure issues, even though this isn't a final rule, take it as that a final rule is likely to come in some form at some point. And I'm sure that MSHA is going to be working as hard as possible to make that something that is put into place before the end of this current administration. I'm sure they're going to want to have a final rule if they can before that, before the next election, or at least before they leave office if there is an administration change. So, similar to kind of what we saw when the Obama administration was leaving, we thought this rule was going to be coming. MSHA did an about face after the election to really push through the new metal non-metal workplace exam rule at that time. So we always kind of have to be mindful of that political play and on rulemaking. And this is enough of a emphasis for MSHA and a priority for MSHA that they are really going to be doing everything they can. So if we already are in trouble, or if we're already having challenges here, we need to look pretty hard at ourselves internally, because the scrutiny is going to grow as this rule gets closer to becoming final, and then it becomes final in some form, assuming that happens. We see that MSHA is talking about administrative controls. The rotation is not considered one, but they look at it as housekeeping, establishing work positions that may be away from the dust or the dust creation source, cleaning of spills, preventing contamination on clothing, or cleaning clothing is actually mentioned in here, which we also see in other discussions of controlling dust. But they don't dig too far into those elements, at least at this time. So, those are areas that we're going to see an emphasis put on, because they are going to be crucial to companies, maintaining dust and maintaining compliance with this new rule. But MSHA is really going to focus on those controls. That is going to be where they are putting their attention. So we've talked that this is a exposure and a monitoring driven rule. So what did we mean by that? It was that it is going to create a lot of monitoring, especially at the beginning. There is both what MSHA refers to in the rule as quantitative monitoring, which is going to be kind of what we would expect in terms of traditional sampling. So getting the cyclone on there, putting it in the breathing zone, having our employee wear it for the next 8 hours or the rest of their shift in order to determine whether or not they were exposed above the PEL. And then also qualitative, which they are counting more so as kind of an evaluation of our process and our equipment to determine if that is pushing us towards compliance and pushing us towards having levels below the PEL. So first, let's talk about kind of what we would traditionally expect, the cyclone monitoring, that kind of sampling. The first element is baseline. So this is going to be a big push probably for companies, especially if we're not familiar with the process of sampling to begin with. But what MSHA has in the proposal is that within 6 months, 180 days of the effective date of the rule, not now, this is if we see a final rule, when we see a final rule, and then the effective date after that, which is meant to be 120 days after the final rule is published. Sampling for each miner who is exposed to respirable crystalline silica or may reasonably be expected to. That's a big term right there, because MSHA goes on to later state in this rule that they assume all miners involved in processing and extraction may reasonably be expected to have exposure to respirable crystalline silica. So that is a big rule. That means that we pretty much have to conduct sampling on all of our employees. They do allow for representative sampling for miners if they're going to be performing the same task on the same shift and in the same work area. But, that doesn't allow us to say we sampled one person and it covers all 3 shifts if we work 3/8, or it doesn't allow us to sample one person on the shift and say that covers everybody. It has to be pretty prescriptive in terms of same task, same shift, same work area. So that's going to be a lot of sampling out the gate. Now, if we do that baseline sampling and our sampling comes back at or below 25 micrograms per meter cubed, that's the action level. We have to verify that. And if we verify it by one of the following methods that's listed up there, we can discontinue that baseline and periodic monitoring until we have a change in the process, which may affect the exposures. But how do we verify it? We verify it by looking at either MSHA sample data from the last 12 months of the date the sample is taken, or if we have additional sample data from the last 12 months that verify that we have exposure under 25 micrograms per meter cubed. Alternatively, you can take another sample within 3 months, or MSHA says you can verify this by objective data, which they include in their definitions, which is could be air monitoring data from industry-wide surveys, or calculations based on the substance, or specific tasks or material and the exposure that is related to it. But it must closely reflect and resemble the conditions that we're talking about. So there's not going to be a lot of leeway to say, oh, no one in this industry gets exposed. It's going to have to be specific to our operation and our environmental controls and conditions. So we're not going to be able to kind of just say, oh, objective data. So it's probably going to be a situation, unless we have very strong objective data for our industry and for our operations, that we have to be looking at other samples. There's a question that if we've already conducted monitoring using this, will it satisfy? This is going to have to be monitoring conducted within 6 months of the rule becoming final. It's going to be new monitoring. Now you could, if you have other data that supports that your levels are under the action level within 12 months of that, you can use that as your verification. But you will have to be conducting baseline monitoring. There's a question here about what is the same work area, how close or how far. It's going, the expectation is going to be that it is, a pretty small area, not, an entire processing building or an entire area part of the plant, or just extraction. It's probably, MSHA's expectation is that you have people who are working on their shift. Now, if we have, a number of laborers who work the same area, that could be considered. And if that's a large area, we can make the argument that that is the same work area. But, it really is going to depend on how your breakdown is with your employees. And to say that, someone works the entire plant and they all work the entire plant, right now, it doesn't seem like MSHA is going to accept that kind of interpretation. But this is something that we can, submit comment on and have those discussions with MSHA, because there is still a good bit of ambiguity despite putting out a proposed rule that is more than 400 pages. Additionally, if baseline monitoring comes back, or really monitoring at any point in time, and our levels show exposure for a particular miner or several miners, that our exposure is somewhere between that action level and that PEL, so between 25 and 50 micrograms, we have to conduct additional monitoring, and they call this periodic monitoring. And if you're familiar with OSHA rule, if you're above the PEL with OSHA, you have to conduct monitoring again within 3 months. If you are above the action level with OSHA, but below the PEL, you have to conduct monitoring again in 6 months. to discontinue monitoring under the OSHA rule, you have to get 2 consecutive samples under the action level more than 7 days apart. So similar, right? A little bit of similarity here with MSHA, except the action, they're talking about periodic monitoring. It doesn't have to do with exceeding the PEL. It has to do with being an exceedance of the action level, but below the PEL. So that 25 to 50 micrograms window. If you have a sample that comes back in there for an employee, you have to conduct sampling again within 3 months. And you have to continue to conduct sampling within 3 months if you keep getting results back in that level until you have 2 consecutive samples below the action level. Now, MSHA does not have the provision in here that it has to be at least 7 days apart, but they ask for comment about whether or not that should be included. But so that is an area though where you can have a lot of exposure to just kind of ongoing sampling. Now, I will say we're talking about such minute amounts of dust that staying within that 25 to 50 range, it's difficult, right? I mean, a small amount of dust, a small amount of dust falling on a miner or shoveling one day, in just for 5 minutes, depending on the conditions and the material at your operation, can put you over. So, I think if you're in this area, hopefully we have some data to suggest this is an outlier, and we get additional sampling in place and make sure that our controls are working and get back under. But I think the expectation that we kind of live in this periodic monitoring is probably unlikely, because if we're in there consistently, we could very easily be over the PEL. We could very easily be under the action level, one sample to the other. But that's why we have to have MSHA is requiring 2 consecutive samples. So, it's going to create a lot of testing, but we're dealing with such small amounts of exposure that you can get there very quickly, and it's going to be kind of an ongoing challenge, I think, for all the operations. In terms of the corrective action sampling, another method of sampling. So this takes place if we do have persons who come back with exposures above the PEL. We will talk about what we are required to do there a bit later in terms of implementing corrective actions. But from a sampling standpoint, we have to put in place corrective action, and then we have to sample. Once those corrective actions are in place, meaning the development of engineering controls, and when we start getting those samples back, we roll into the same periodic monitoring question, right? So we get a sample below the PEL, but above the action level, we're still in it, right? We just can reduce some of our corrective measures at that point, such as the mandatory use of respiratory protection, but we still have to get that second sample below the action level before we can discontinue. So even if you have exposures above the PEL, you're in the same sampling method. You just don't have to do it within 3 months. If individuals have to wear respiratory protection, we need to be moving quickly to get levels below, but we still have to conduct sampling in order to get verification that we're not being exposed below it. Another area of the kind of monitoring is the semi-annual evaluation. We talked about this as being our kind of our qualitative versus our quantitative. And this is an interesting requirement because it requires that every 6 months, and it would begin a year after the rule becomes final, the operator has to evaluate their process, right? Evaluate their equipment, their processing, their engineering and administrative controls, to determine if there's factors that, new factors or changes that are going to increase the likelihood of exposure, or may reasonably result in exposure to respirable crystalline silica. You have to make a record of the evaluation. You have to date the evaluation. You have to post your record of the evaluation on a Mind bulletin board, either or an electronic bulletin board for 31 days. You're going to have to be able to make this available to MSHA upon request. And if your evaluation indicates that there is a reasonable, it can be reasonably expected that you're going to expose individuals above the action level, you have to do post-evaluation sampling. So that is another timeliness where we have, possibly this 3-month testing on the periodic, but then if not, we're at a 6-month evaluation schedule. I think there's questions here about if, the evaluation schedule should be annual, and then if new equipment is installed. I think that it seems more reasonable than a semi-annual schedule, but clearly that is something that we can approach comment on and consider putting that in. To do it every 6 months and then have to sample possibly at that same time, it I think could be pretty burdensome. I would expect that an annual as opposed to a semi-annual evaluation is a lot more palatable. And when we saw MSHA's most recent rule on, or proposed rule, I guess we have never seen a final on it, on surface mobile equipment, that had an annual review element to it. So, I could see a push that direction, and I think that's a more reasonable approach than a semi-annual review and evaluation. But nonetheless, this gives you kind of 2 rules in a row, or 2 proposed rules in a row, where MSHA is thinking, I'm going to require you guys to evaluate your operations and your conditions annually, or semi-annually in this case, document it, and in this case, post it, and you have to make it available. So it's a bit of an interesting element that we definitely don't have now, right? Our rule right now says we just have to do testing regular or as much as necessary to determine that we are being compliant. But we are obviously going to have a lot more onus on continuous evaluation and continuously looking at ways that we can get below. Now, part of this that always kind of worries from a liability perspective is we're going to have this record of evaluations. We're going to have to keep these for 2 years. What happens if we have overexposures when MSHA comes on the site that's at sample, or we have a kind of ongoing issues with kind of living between this action level and this permissible exposure level? We both can look back here and see what changed, if anything, and hopefully that helps us make those corrections, but also MSHA is going to be able to have those records too. And they're going to be looking at, if there were changes, did we not recognize it? Did we not take aggressive enough or appropriate corrective actions in there? And that all comes back as possibly being the basis for enforcement, or if it's something that comes up routinely and we didn't take appropriate action, what they deem appropriate action, it could be the basis for elevated actions, whether high negligence or 104Ds or so on and so forth. In terms of the next element, I just say a couple questions. One, is there an air factor to be part of the PEL? The PEL is going to be 50 micrograms per meter cubed. The air factor would take place in the lab analysis and the evaluation there. So there would be a consideration, but it's not necessarily in the regulation, it's in the evaluation by the labs. And then if a sample tests above 50, does MSHA require pre-approval of corrective actions to be implemented? No, there's nothing in there. There are prescribed, though, corrective actions that we're going to talk about here that you have to get going in terms of, MSHA says these have to be part of it, but you don't have to run them by them if you've done a sample that comes back above 50. Now, if MSHA runs a sample and that comes back above the PEL, then it's yet to be seen, but they may require additional or pre-approval of corrective actions to be implemented in addition to what's already in the standard. I think that probably, though, is more likely if we have a pattern of exposure above the PEL, or if we are, resampling and taking action, but we are not getting it below the PEL. That is something that I think could be, MSHA could insert themselves into more. So we definitely see that today, even if they don't think we are taking enough action to get below the PEL. There's a question about how is the rule going to affect contractors working in areas where exposure could be present. I mean, it's going to apply to contractors as well as operators. So you as a contractor will be tasked with determining, whether or not there's an issue, whether or not your persons are going to be exposed above. You're going to have to engage in the periodic sampling, and I know that does add a pretty significant layer, or at least it could, of challenges depending on what type of contractor you are and how many sites you're working at and for how long and what kind of areas. But this, just like any other MSHA rule, this will apply to contractors just as much as it does production operators. So that is something that has to be considered when you're going into different areas or different mines as you go with, if this rule comes into effect in this form or some version of it. Additionally, on the sampling side, and this is kind of just a bit of background thing, we're going to be conducted for a 8-hour time weighted average. We've talked about that. You must put the sample in the breathing zone of the miner. That again is not going to be a surprise, right? It is going to be the normal testing procedures there that we currently use now, or we see now. We have to have sampling equipment that conforms to ISO standards. Again, this is pretty normal stuff. We have to use ISO accredited labs, and those labs have to use the analysis either outlined by MSHA, NIOSH, or OSHA, which is X-ray diffraction methods. So, those are all pretty straightforward. We should consider that. Though, if you're sending out samples, you have to make sure that your lab is using the proper methods, and you have to make sure that your equipment that you're obtaining, whether you purchase it or you're renting it, or a consultant is coming on site and using it, that they are adhering to these requirements. Now, most consultants should know that, but if you're going to be doing sampling on your own, just make sure that those are things that you're checking off. In terms of records, records for sampling have to include the date, sampled occupation, results for respirable crystalline silica, and respirable dust exposure. They have to be maintained for at least 2 years by the operator, and records must be posted, including the lab reports, for 31 days. That's an interesting one. That's so if any sampling that takes place, it has to be posted. That has to be either electronic or that has to be physical or both. Just like we see a requirement with posting citations, but this has a specific time period on it. So for 31 days. Additionally, these records, and this is from the proposed rule itself, but we see evaluation records. So that's our semi-annual. Those have to be kept from 2 years from the date of each evaluation. Sampling records, the same. Corrective action records. If we do have to take corrective actions, we have to make record of that now, and we got to keep those again for 2 years. If we have a written determination record received from a doctor, a physician, or other licensed healthcare professional, we have to keep that for the duration of the miner's employment. And this goes to medical surveillance plus 6 months, and then medical opinions, the same. All of these records, MSHA says, have to be kept. They have to be made available at the request of MSHA, which is an authorized representative of the secretary and an authorized representative of miners, so miners rep. And so that, again, is kind of this is going to be a new one on our list of workplace exams and pre-ops and training records, is going to be a review of your silica record keeping. So The record keeping burden, you're going to have to figure out a way to keep track of this for your operations. If you're over multiple operations, it's going to be a bit of a burden on that side. There's a question about could posting of the results be a potential HIPAA violation? You're supposed to remove any reference. You're not supposed to report or post any medical evaluation or medical surveillance. That does have the potential for a HIPAA violation, but an exposure monitoring result does not necessarily. And you wouldn't necessarily have to include the name on it. The required record doesn't include that. It includes the occupation, the date, and the results. So you could do that without including minors' names. But no, you wouldn't be posting the medical opinions or the medical surveillance, and that is where the protection would be from a HIPAA standpoint. There's one question here. It says, will MSHA cite the operator for samples that we take that are above the PEL based on a review of the records? That's a good question. Probably not for every sample that they find over, but if there is a history of overexposures and you might not get an overexposure citation, but there's other factors here. Did you take corrective actions? What were those corrective actions? And if we have do we have appropriate engineering controls? Do we have appropriate administrative controls? Are we sampling sufficiently? Do we have the right PPE in place? Those are all opportunities for enforcement. And if we have a history of overexposures, we're going to get more scrutiny, and that could be higher negligence, unwarrantable failures. So do I think MSHA is going to come out and say, hey, Nick, you guys recorded an overexposure last month, I'm going to issue a citation? I don't think so. I don't anticipate that's going to be the stance of the agency. I'm sure that we will hear about it from some inspector somewhere at some point. But they could. There's no statute of limitations. It's proof of an overexposure. But I think there's going to be one that does not encourage responsible sample taking. And I think MSHA is going to be trying to do what they can to encourage compliance on that front. And two, there's many other opportunities. If you have an overexposure, if you have an exceedance of the PEL, there's a lot of things that you're going to have to be doing that I think MSHA is going to be able to look at. And I would imagine that history of overexposures will most likely be used to increase negligence or to increase severity more so than, and possibly then move things up to an unwarrantable failure status than be their own instance of violation. Although it is possible. I'm not going to say it's not possible. In terms of corrective actions, if sampling, again, this comes into effect if we are at sampling greater than the PEL, so greater than 50 micrograms per meter cube, the operator must implement corrective actions. Part of that is to ensure that affected minors wear respiratory protection for a full shift and during the period of overexposure until the minor exposures are at or below the PEL. If we get a test result over the PEL, we need to put minors in respiratory protection by the next shift. The respiratory protection has to meet certain standards that we'll talk about on the next slide, but we have to put it in there, and then we have to take corrective actions to lower the concentration of respirable silica. The idea is going to be that is using engineering controls to get it below. Now, this is all based, the sampling is supposed to be based on normal shift, right? A normal shift is supposed to be what we're tracking here. So if we have a catastrophic breakdown and there's, our dust collection system fails, or we have a conveyor spilling sand all over the place, that's not necessarily representative of a normal shift. So if we have a sample coming back there, you need to be conducting additional sampling immediately. The idea would though probably be that you still need to implement the requirements of respiratory protection, which is I think an area that we're going to have some questions, even if it's not a normal shift because some abnormality occurred. But that's going to implement the requirements of the respiratory protection program, the ASTM program. So we're going to have to be prepared before this rule comes out that if we get an overexposure, we can act quickly. And I say that meaning we're going to have respiratory protections developed if we have any kind of exposure to RCS on our site. Because if we have a test result come back, and again, it's not difficult to exceed 50 micrograms per meter cubed. If we have silica concentrations at our operation and in the materials we're mining and processing, we're going to have to be prepared for this to occur. We're going to have to record those corrective actions. What kind of engineering controls have we changed? What kind of evaluations have we done? Is there a reason why this was occurred, such as a breakdown that makes it not representative? And then we're going to have to, again, conduct sampling, and we're going to have to do sampling in the way of the periodic until we get 2 consecutive samples below the action level. And if we continue to go over the PEL, we're going to have to keep taking on additional and new corrective actions until we get them below the PEL. And then once we get in between in that kind of PEL and action level range, I mean, the only way to get out of consistently doing the monitoring every 3 months is to get additional corrective actions in place. So you'll want to track those if that time comes. So again, a lot of sampling, a lot of tracking in the event of this. But if you get back under the PEL, you can discontinue at least by the way the rules way it reads right now, you can discontinue the use of respiratory protection, which takes us to our next slide. And I see some questions coming in. Please keep sending them in. I will be responding to you all directly after the webinar, just to keep us moving here as we're getting closer to the 2 o'clock hour. But with respiratory protection, it's only permitted for temporary use. It's not permitted for use in long-term or in normal day-to-day operations. It has to be while engineering controls are being developed and implemented, or it's necessary by the nature of the work involved. So if we have a very specific task which we cannot get below, respiratory protection could be an option. But I will tell you now, even under the existing standard and with the way that OSHA implements it, feasibility is not an argument the agencies are really interested in accepting without a lot of legwork behind it. So if we are arguing that's not feasible to get personnel below the exposure levels for a particular task, we better have some serious material to back that up, because they're not just going to accept that on its face. The idea is that this pushes us forward towards better source control as opposed to using respiratory protection to get people below. It's meant as a supplement, not as a compliance measure. Additionally, we have a provision that says minors, addressing minors that are unable to wear respirators. This is new for MSHA, right? We don't have this in there. It's somewhat similar, although not identical to kind of the Part 90 protections in coal, although that specifically says if you have damage, a black lung or silicosis, and you cannot perform your job, or it's dangerous to perform your job, and a medical professional says so, you have to be moved to a different area. This is saying if a physician says that, Nick can't wear a respirator, and there's an area that I'm working in that has to have a respirator, you're required to move me, right? You're required me to put me in a different area at the same rate of pay until that's corrected, and then move me back. So, when respirators are no longer required. So that is specifically something that we're seeing in this regulation. Additionally, the medical surveillance stance is going to be another big kind of hurdle and a unique thing that we don't usually see or we don't see that often in the metal non-metal industry. But this rule is going to require that metal non-metal operators provide to each miner periodic medical examination, which includes medical and work history, physical exam on the respiratory system emphasis is placed, chest x-rays, pulmonary function tests. That examination has to be offered at least every 5 years, and really it's within 3.5 to 4.5 years of when the last one took place, so that people have time to do it within that 5-year stretch. But this is something that's normal in the coal industry. It's new to the metal non-metal, but it is going to be something that under this proposed rule, MSHA wants to require us to offer. The mandatory part is interesting because it says that every new miner must receive a medical examination within 30 days of employment, a follow-up within 3 years, and a follow-up with a specialist within 2 years if the follow-up at the 3-year mark shows evidence of decreased lung function. So this is not for newly hired experienced miners. This is not for rehiring a miner. This is for brand new miners. It is really MSHA establishing a baseline that every new miner coming into the industry is going to have baseline sampling and a baseline medical evaluation. So this is a pretty, in my opinion, future or forward-looking requirement that is trying to generate an idea about how miners are being affected moving forward. The mine operator shall obtain a written medical opinion within 30 days of an examination. It has to contain the date, the statement, and any recommendations on the use of respirators. There's a number of different requirements there. In terms of the medical evaluation after that kind of first one, which is required, subsequent that 5-year cycle, those are optional. So the miners don't have to be participating in them. They have to be offered it, and we have to make it available, but it is not required. And similarly for the new miners, after they get that first 30-day evaluation, which is required, and after they get that follow-up in 3 years, if they're not referred to a specialist, moving forward, it's optional. It has to be made available every 5 years, but it is not required. So again, it will be something that we have to do for new miners, but we don't have to grandfather in existing miners or future newly hired experienced miners who are into this mandatory requirement. So, I'm trying to stay on time as much as possible for everybody, but that is an overview of the elements. There's still a lot of questions to be had and a lot of questions to evaluate. I know there's a good bit in the chat right now, and we'll make sure that we're going to follow up with everyone who has a question in the chat that we did not get to answer during this presentation today directly. But I just want to remind everybody, if you want to submit comment, you can. If you want assistance with that, if your company wants to submit comments, or you're part of an industry association that wants to submit comments, feel free to reach out to me on that as well. It's something that we are working with some clients on already, and we're happy to work with you, whether that's submitting written comments and preparing those, or helping you develop some written testimony and focus in on the areas if you want to speak at one of the meetings. But aware of that, I saw one question that came in about what is the likelihood of the comments deadline being extended. It's possible. It's not uncommon in rulemaking for MSHA or OSHA or a regulatory body in general to extend that. So it is possible. I don't think it's you know, I'm not going to say it's likely, I'm not going to guarantee it, but it is quite possible that we will see an extension on that, especially with a rule of such substance that is guaranteed to generate a lot of comments from industry that MSHA is going to have to review. You know, this process of going through the rulemaking on silica has already been in play for a number of years. And when we're talking about back in 2015 and 2016, MSHA rumblings that they were going to put out this rule around the time that OSHA did. That OSHA rule took more than a decade to finalize and roll out. So I'm not saying we have a decade before we see a final rule from MSHA, but I'm saying it is possible that, you know, these deadlines that we have up on the screen right now are going to be pushed back some. And I think there's probably a lot of people that are going to be submitting comments initially that just say, we need additional time. I mean, MSHA released, again, a 400-page plus proposed rule and really sought comment on every element of that rule. So if that is something that you want to discuss further, you know, I encourage you to reach out with that. I appreciate everyone, you know, patience as we ran through a lot of information today, and we'll make sure that we keep you updated, keep the information coming as we learn new things and there are developments, and make sure that we keep you guys abreast of any changes as they happen. If you want to reach out to me directly, feel free. There's my phone number, direct line, and my email. I'm happy to engage in further discussion offline with all of you, and really, you know, welcome your input and appreciate you joining today and for participating.